Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Elizabeth and Robert Strickland Lecture at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. My name is Corey Walker. I'm Interim Dean of the School of Divinity and the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities. And on behalf of the entire community at the School of Divinity, I want to thank you for joining us today for this very special event. The Strickland Lecture brings a distinguished scholar of religion to speak at Wake Forest University to engage some of the most pressing issues in religion and public life. This year, we have the honor of welcoming a dear friend of Wake Forest University and former colleague to deliver this year's Strickland Lecture. In 2015, in an open letter to presidents and deans of theological schools in the United States, the Reverend Dr. Alton B. Pollard III, joined by other African American presidents and deans in theological education in the United States, wrote, "From a manger in Bethlehem, a Bantustan in Soweto, a bus in Montgomery, a freedom summer in Mississippi, a bridge in Selma, a street in Ferguson, a doorway and shots fired in Detroit, a Moral Monday in Raleigh, an assault in an elevator in Atlantic City, an office building in Colorado Springs, a market in Paris, a wall in Palestine, a pilgrimage to the shrine of Rincon, and a restoration of ties between Cuba and the United States on December 17th, the kidnapping and assault of young school-age girls and the reported killing of 2,000 women, children, and men in Nigeria, a new generation of dream defenders, a transgender teen's suicide note, to our abuse on the environment, God sends a sign, a Kairos moment. The racial climate in the United States and the respect for our common humanity everywhere is clearly in decline. Pollard's bold call is one that is more urgent than ever in our contemporary moment. His is a voice we need to hear now. Rare is the theological institution today that innovates well in contemporary society, modeling theological education for just inclusivity in an increasingly diverse world. These words by Dr. Alton Pollard III remind us of the essence and need for a bold and brave voice in theological education, one we at Wake Forest University School of Divinity have sought to embody and to transmit to future generations of faith leaders. The Reverend Dr. Alton B. Pollard is Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary's 10th president. He began his service with Louisville Seminary in September of 2018. A scholar, author, consultant, and speaker on the subject of African American and U.S. religion and culture, Pollard was previously Dean of the School of Divinity and Professor of Religion and Culture at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Prior to his 11 years at Howard University, Pollard served as Director of Black Church Studies and Chair of American Religious Cultures at Emory University and taught at Wake Forest University and St. Olaf College. He is the author of Mysticism and Social Change, The Social Witness of Howard Thurman, and a new edition of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Negro Church, as well as co-author of Helpers for a Healing Community, a pastoral care manual for HIV/AIDS. He has also edited and co-edited several volumes, including How Long This Road, Race, Religion, and the Legacy of C. Eric Lincoln, The Papers of Howard Washington Thurman, Volumes 1 and 2, and The Black Church Studies Reader. He has also written dozens of book chapters, journal articles, and op-eds. He serves on the board of directors for the Entrust Center for Theological Schools and the advisory committee for the Luce Fund for Theological Education. He served on the board of commissioners for the Association of Theological Schools from 2010 through 2016 and was chair from 2014 through 2016. Pollard earned his BA in Religion and Philosophy and Business Management from Fisk University, his MDiv from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from Duke University's Department of Religion. He's a native of St. Paul, Minnesota, and Pollard is joined here by his dear wife, Jessica. Welcome back, Jessica. And he is the father of 2 adult children. Please join me in welcoming a friend of Wake Forest University, a dear colleague, and most importantly, a dear comrade, the Reverend Dr. Alton B. Pollard III.
Good afternoon, everyone. When Dean Walker brought me into Wake Chapel earlier to survey the space, it took me back to many consequential moments in this institution. But the one that I remember best, and that is most important to me, having lectured here on a number of occasions, preached from the pulpit from a number of occasions, but the one, Shagun, that I will always remember the most is when our son graduated with his MBA from Wake Forest University. Jessica, I don't even remember what year that was. Do you remember? Was it 2010, 2011, somewhere around there? Our hearts were filled to bursting. That our child, who was a knucklehead growing up, along with his sister, had accomplished so much. And on my desk here at Wake Forest, Corey, back in the day, I had, remember that paper, that script that you used to have in elementary school with the really big spaces for writing, learning your block letters and whatnot? What do you call it? Cornbread paper. Remember, our son Brooks had written on there, Jessica, do you remember that? And our daughter did something very similar as well, but had written a piece about what their parents did. And Jessica was gainfully employed, but their father was always in school. And even though I was working in school, it never occurred to them that I was actually being paid to be here. They just knew that I was always at school. So I think about that to this day. A special thanks to our dean, Corey Walker, for this invitation to be here, and you can blame him or thank him when I'm done. One thing that can be said, I'm never at a lack for words, except for when emotions run high. And being at Wake Forest in this moment evokes a lot of that. To my colleagues who are here for the symposium today, panelists who shined so luminously, and allowed the rest of us to participate in the wisdom that they were sharing over the course of the afternoon. It was really good to be with you. To those of you who I've known and Jessica have known through the years, for decades, it is really good to see you. I saw Mary earlier. Is Mary still here? Oh, Mary is still there. Okay. And of course, Shegun Ilasanmi, who is near and dear to Jessica, he and Bola and their family, and to all of you, it's good to be here. Okay, let me stop with the preliminaries and get to work. But I need to say one more thing before I go on. When Corey called and invited me to speak, I did something very out of character. I said yes, without looking at my calendar. And it wasn't until quite recently that I found out, Mark, that the date that I was here was also the date that the Grawemeyer Award winner in religion was going to be at my institution. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Grawemeyer Award, but the Grawemeyer Award is considered to be the most prestigious award in religion and theology. It's a $100,000 prize, and this year's recipient is Kelly Brown Douglas. Yes, there you go. And I was grateful to be able to welcome her to our seminary before I left on Tuesday, and to then tell her, I won't see you on Thursday when you actually lecture at our institution. But Kelly and I go way back too, Corey, so it was a joyful meeting. 35 years ago. Oh, let me tell you what the title of my presentation is. It's a very simple one, but I think it's consistent with the introduction that Corey read. You know, you read stuff that I didn't even remember that I had written. He knows how to mine, doesn't he? He's really an intellectual anthropologist. Knows how to do that excavation. Freedom's Call, a journey in faith. 35 years ago, Jessica and I arrived on the campus of Wake Forest University. We did not know what powerful and humanizing life lessons lay ahead over the next 10 years. So began our connections with this institution of higher learning in terms of our own personal sense of call and commitment to the search for common ground. There were other callings. Life's call to what Vincent Harding aptly describes as, and I quote, the role of the impossible in human affairs. To commit as part of this stellar academic community to leaning into the ever-expanding struggle for social transformation, to embrace new forms of possibility for the humanity of us all, to somehow explore untested manifestations of freedom, democracy, and change in an age of outrageous injustice. I was further called to the work and world of academe writ large, to plumb the depths of the religious enterprise, employing the social sciences. Ryan, is Ryan still here? The social sciences, Ryan. As a means to challenge forms of hierarchy and racist convention. From the first, my calling was to do research and scholarship from the standpoint of the oppressed. I've never been ambiguous about it. The callings have been at once fierce and insistent, faithful and disruptive, if I may, kindred spirit to pro humanitate. In 1988, Jessica was appointed Associate Director of Career Services here, and I was invited to join what was then the Religion Department faculty. Our son, Brooks was age 7, and our daughter, Asha, a mere 3 weeks old at the time. My first informal association with Wake came in the form of a phone call. I was working on my dissertation, minding my business in Durham, North Carolina, when religion professor G. McLeod Bryan, anybody know that name? Mac, as he was famously known, was on the other end. I was surprised to hear that he wanted to have a conversation with me. I soon came to find out that Mac was something of a firebrand, a maverick, a transformative nonconformist, a white Baptist scholar and activist who was always ready to interrupt and interrogate the status quo, a man after my own heart. Instrumental in the first student of African descent enrolling at Wake in the early 1960s, he was now getting ready to retire and still inspiring his colleagues to embrace the winds of academic change. Reflecting back on that initial conversation, that life-altering call, I never did ask Mac how it was that he came to contact me. Mac drove to Durham, where we met for lunch. Early on, I had no investment, zero, in his proposal to consider Wake. In the first place, Jessica and I were proud alums of Fisk University. My life's ambition was to teach at our alma mater, if possible, or another HBCU, Corey, if not, to give back to the culture, as it were. Decades would pass before that dream finally materialized for me at Howard University School of Divinity, where I was privileged to serve as dean and professor for 10 years. Not long after meeting Mac, I gave a paper at the national meeting of the Association for the Sociology of Religion. Wake Forest alumnus and then religion department chair, Carlton T. Mitchell, came forward and introduced himself. I thought it was a case of mistaken identity. I had experienced a full week of meetings with nothing but sociologists who acted as if I was invisible in the meeting. I was the only person of color there. But Carlton had traveled to the conference specifically to hear my presentation. His field of expertise was not in the sociology of religion, religion and culture, or the history of religions, all my areas. He rose from his seat to offer me a possible teaching job at Wake. I was stunned. Jessica and I soon arrived at this campus. That was then, and this is now. Shortly after I became president of Louisville Seminary, I received a call from a former student, one whose name I had not heard in many years. Wake Forest alumna, Louisville native, and she would be surprised to hear her name called today. Attorney Kate McCune heard that her former professor had moved to the area and reached out to invite Jessica and I to dinner at her home. When we got there, we were surprised to find other Wake alums present. The meal was exquisite. Kate can cook. My former students raucously recited, line and verse, ideas large and small from my classes. The spring of 1994 especially stood out for them as a watershed moment, for they remembered my leaving midway through the semester. I had been invited to serve as an international monitor for South Africa's first democratic elections. Soon, Madiba, Nelson Mandela, would be celebrated as the world's first democratically elected president of the new South Africa. What's so interesting about that is that while he was being celebrated around the world, he would also remain on the U.S. terrorist list until 2008. With the rise of the African National Congress as a major political force, legal apartheid came to an end. I'm going to share with you some excerpts from my diary that I kept at the time and published, A Dawn of Freedom. I feel the power of a nation within me. These were the striking words uttered by Sojourner Truth nearly 2 centuries ago. Words that I carry with me now from the United States to South Africa. I feel an utter calm and peace about the journey on which I now embark. Like Sister Sojourner, I too feel the power. It is the collective power of family, colleagues, students, and friends who expressed, despite heartfelt trepidation, theirs, not mine, great joy and excitement about my journey. I go in the power of their spirit, and it is sustenance for my soul. I feel as well the power of the ancestors, a darkly radiant presence on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. African foreparents brutalized, colonized, and enslaved against their will, and so, in truth, they still live on. Their spirit of struggle is something which I deeply affirm. Indeed, it now possesses me. It is a power that bridges Africa and the United States, a freedom song coursing through my veins, to know no rest until justice and peace are had by all. There is a further power that I carry within me to South Africa that also comes from the church, from kindred spirits whose heartfelt prayers mean much. How can I not impart their strength and courage, their sense of presence to millions of South Africans awaiting apartheid's legal end? I know their prayers are carrying me forth, that siblings in the faith are encouraging and supporting me. It is no accident that my April journey began at Easter. At the very least, this Resurrection Day confirms that the people of South Africa, all the people, will begin to know liberation at last. Chief Albert Luthuli, Lillian Ngoyi, Stephen Biko, Mampela Rempele, Miriam Makeba, Hu Masekela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Raymond Mslaba, Hector Peterson, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu are but a few of the vast collective of children, women, and men who constituted the ever-expanding community of struggle for freedom in South Africa in the latter part of the 20th century. Like wildfire, the struggle against apartheid spread across the generations and continents and cultures through long years, changing and adapting in emphasis from nonviolent resistance to the armed struggle and back to nonviolence again, and in time to disinvestment campaigns worldwide. The people of South Africa answered freedom's call with an anti-racist and anti-imperialist mass movement that resonated with the hopes and aspirations of freedom struggles around the world. The proposition that there can be other ways of living, knowing, and being in the world beyond the hegemonic, that people can unite to organize their lives collectively, that democracy can come from below, repressive regimes can be challenged, imprisoned freedom fighters can be set free, justice and equality are emancipatory themes, and beloved, community is possible, disrupts narratives of the status quo and alters valences of power. 30 years later, the dismantling of apartheid in legal terms still has not equated to the end of anti-Black racism in South Africa. The end of political apartheid was terribly important and should not be underestimated. At the same time, the eradication of legal apartheid was, in and of itself, not enough to end racism's far vaster structural workings in industry, technology, education, commerce, and more. Well-organized mass movements are needed more than ever. Mobilization, Sabrina, needed now more than ever to wield collective power that pressures progressive change. there is so much more freedom work to be done. Now, it is true there have been black and brown individuals that have entered the social hierarchy in South Africa, and they have excelled. But the overwhelming number of people are overwhelmed by a deeply entrenched economic and sociological apartheid, despite the successful dismantling of the former political apparatus. And the same is true in the United States. Such time-tested tropes as rugged individualism, law and order, and make America great again, emanating from state houses and school districts to carceral centers and corporate corridors, work to preserve the status quo ante and to obscure and obstruct the very issues at the heart of the struggle for justice. At the same time, when we who dare to believe in freedom's song journey deeply enough into the heart of the struggle for truth, justice, and hope that resides in every human community at levels far beyond any words, when we believe with that level of integrity, new, creative, and expansive understandings of what it means to be human appear. I heard you today, Keisha. The anti-apartheid struggle, more than a historic contest for legal rights, is a dynamic and continuing story. It is, when understood, a Black-led, multiracial quest for democracy in South Africa. But it is not just for South Africa. It is for the healing of the nations and for the freeing of all our spirits. This is freedom's call. It is a story of optimism of the will that belongs to every one of us everywhere in every place and time. It is a courageous story of human solidarity that decenters and disprivileges the Western world. It is a visionary story that reverberates with humankind's best movements for personal and social transformation in the face of racism and fascism and sexism. It is an altogether human story in all its majestic imperfections that makes lively connections between the Black movement for freedom in America, womanist struggles and radical feminist struggles, and the struggles of people of all genders and sexualities and nationalities inside and outside of apartheid's walls, inside and outside of prison walls, inside and outside the carceral state. Not only that, but lessons from the history of the anti-apartheid struggle demonstrate the power of human solidarity in the face of oppression, ways which work to empower everyday people who are searching desperately for the best possibilities rather than defaulting to the worst tendencies in us all. So even though the struggle for freedom, the commitment to freedom is not and need not be everywhere universally the same, the South African freedom struggle is one with the story of martyred students in China's Tiananmen Square. It links with marchers, activists, and organizers in Eastern Europe bringing down the Berlin Wall, and global participants of the late last century who envisioned and moved us then toward the cessation of the Cold War. Historically, and even now, it is the intersectional province of all people across the world having sweet dreams of freedom that burst across the globe when we least expect it, perhaps even now when we need it most. Sometimes, when we begin to fathom the deepest meanings of freedom from another time, place, and people, when we mind the movements of their lived history, when we accept their tutelage, powerful possibilities may be continually open to us all in the here and now. Freedom's call can call us away from dreamless dreams and limited visions, from cynical postures and fatalistic prospects that convince us new beginnings are not possible. Freedom's call can inspire us to new well springs of hope and the work of creating new worlds. The anti-apartheid movement and Wake Forest were formative for me in those years, but so too was the brilliant work of Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman continues to speak to me still. Howard Thurman, for anyone who may not know, noted theologian, mystic, scholar, clergy person. But in this moment, I want to talk about his black fact. A man who conveyed a quiet sense of confidence, a centered presence in his every movement. He was deep rivers of meditation, luminous darkness within and without. Thurman was born into the world of the white supremacist South at the end of the 19th century, one generation removed from his own grandmother's vivid experiences of having been enslaved. He lived through the Jim Crow era, the Ku Klux Klan, the deadly influenza pandemic of 1918, the Great Depression, restrictive housing covenants, 2 world wars, and rumors of wars. That was the world of Howard Thurman. I invite you to hear these fierce and insistent words from this venerable ancestor, this companion on the way, scholar, mentor, friend, and I quote, "If there be any government or social institution of whatever kind that operates among young people in a manner that makes for human misery, whether of the mind through fear and despair, or of the body through the freezing of the freedom of movement, or of the spirit through the destruction of any sense of the future, such a government or such a social institution, without regard to its sanctions, is evil. To the extent that it is so, it cannot survive, because it is against life and carries within the seeds of its own destruction. The moral law is binding. There can be no mistake." In 1946, Thurman issued a provocative challenge to the church in the U.S., and Corey, I know you know this work, so few unfortunately do. And the name of the essay is The Fascist Masquerade. It's one of my favorite Thurman pieces. People always look at me and say, "Fascist Masquerade? Why would that be a favorite?" Because people have assumed that because of the profundity of his mystic expression, there could be no social agency. In fact, his social agency was predicated upon the profundity of the depths of his experience of the sacred. Thurman's article, written after Mussolini's failed attempt to colonize Ethiopia, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, powerfully analyzes the authoritarian basis for fascism and its concomitants in race, class, and religion, beginning with Italy and Germany and pivoting to post-war movements in the United States, before addressing the critical failings of white Christian churches. Thurman's insights date back now to more than 75 years, and they remain relevant given our present-day circumstance, which is an incendiary mix of political machinations, terroristic movements, and insurrectionist events, no less forms of social, cultural, and religious arrogance at home and abroad. Fascist Masquerade opens with a lengthy review and discussion of fascism as a doctrine. It's not a word we like to talk about in the United States of America, but it's a word that we need to address, with examples that are in his essay ranging from Mussolini and then discussions by the U.S. War Department. 3 elements stand out in common, and I quote, "In the first place, the state is not only central, but supreme in its complete control and direction of the economic life. In the second place, the individual is always and in all circumstances subordinate to the state. And what is more important, the significance of the individual is defined by the state. In the third place, the state is epitomized by that individual or those individuals who are able to speak on behalf of or themselves to personify the state. So to repeat, for Thurman, the basic fascist doctrine of the state is characterized by 1, centralized authoritarianism, 2, the subordination of the individual to the interests of the state, and 3, exalted dictatorial leadership in an increasingly regimented society as the basis for a doctrine of social inequality, from which flows the justifications for racism, vigilantism, and terror. The base appeal to bigotries, grounded in race, social class, and religion, serve as dog whistles. And I believe if Thurman were alive today, he would add gender and sexuality and a host of other quarantining realities in our society to this notion of the fascist masquerade. The real concern of any fascist movement is control of the levers of power and the priorities of privilege, while the rank and file citizen pays the price. Now, if this does not sound familiar to you, then I'm not sure what country you are living in right now. Thurman goes on in his essay to discuss 3 fascist-leaning groups in the U.S., and I won't take time for those except to note that they would all fall, Amanda, very definitely within the line of white Christian nationalism. And of course, the most famous of them is the Ku Klux Klan, but there are others. But Thurman saves his most searing indictment for the church. And this is where some of us will say, huh? He indicts the church for its doctrine of salvation, which intentionally or otherwise posits a theory of inequality based on grace. Now, what do I mean by that? You've got the saved and you've got the sinner. Posits a theory of inequality, which in practice has translated into forms of inequality based on race, gender, class, sexuality, ethnicity, ability, and a host of other socially disqualifying categories. Now, in society, we don't say saved and sinner. We simply consider superior and inferior. Thurman avers that the role of the church is to affirm the intrinsic quality and worth of every human being without exception. There can be no litmus test for sacrality or belonging. To the extent that the Christian church then demonstrates the courage and wherewithal to practice its own revolutionary ethic of love, it denies other cults of inequality the scaffolding upon which much of their spiritual arrogance and political fascism are founded. Thurman is unequivocal in his assessment, and I quote, "The church must be as revolutionary in practice as it is in the genius of the ethic to which it is dedicated." There is a Latin expression, vox victimarum vox Dei. It means the cries of the people are the voice of God. However, this is a theological provocation that goes further. It says these are not just the cries of any people, but the victimized ones. Among the disparate people who have cried aloud in the U.S. are those who were, quote, stamped from the beginning for racial and social inequality, as Ibram X. Kendi would say. Entire communities who were relegated to the underside of history, made marginal, stigmatized, condemned to social death, and who yet and still know there is more to themselves, more to us, more to all of us than this. God not only hears our cries, the freedom cries of this nation's children, women, and men of African descent, and other communities of the dispossessed, the cries of our spirit are the cries of God. The decades have passed since Jessica and I first had the opportunity to come to Wake and my own extensive travels across the African continent. Since those days, South Africa, Ghana, Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, Swaziland, the former, Zambia, Egypt, Ethiopia, and more have been my constant griots and teachers. So too has been the African diaspora in the Caribbean, the UK, the Americas, South, Canada, and elsewhere. And looking back, I realize now that I sometimes took for granted the ties between the struggles of all the children of Africa. Painfully, the end of legal apartheid in 1994 in South Africa seems to have diminished the concern many Black Americans had in our own historical homeland, the African continent. Now, if you're like me, you are also always concerned about the health of U.S. democratic life. Never forget the words of MLK, who told us that ours is an extremely sick society. There are uneasy silences and valences, omissions and contradictions, unknowns and untruths in our history in this country that contribute to our divided commitments to social injustice today. Our struggle as a nation is to fulfill the broken promises of the Declaration of Independence, the breach of the Constitution, and founding ideals of a pluralism yet unrealized. The global industrial complex continues to grow. The wealthy titans of industry and innovation are acclaimed for living their best dream, even at the expense of others. In the United States, especially for the aspiring middle class who are predominantly white, but not only, the allure and prospect of free market economic growth is diminishing. Capitalism is losing its punch. For the poor and working poor, there was never any such illusion to begin with. For many, the optimistic rhetoric of the good life has been co-opted by the commodification of life, festering social and cultural uncertainty, dispiriting anxiety, distressing anonymity, and paradoxical fear. Layer upon layer for the poor, working poor, and middle class alike, disenchantment grows. For rank and file Black America, the nightmare simply continues. In the words of the noted African-American poet Herbert Woodward Martin, and I quote, "Nothing has changed, we have slipped backward. A good deal has changed, we are moving forward." Somewhere in between the dialectical tension exists our reality. Boy, I have so much more to say, but I need to skip forward. And let me go to this place to talk about young people, the millennials of Generation Z and Generation A not far behind, who have known a world made harsh and opaque thanks to a host of socially constructed discriminations, heterogeneities, identifications, and inheritances grounded in geography, sexuality, race, class, brutal policing, racial profiling, legislative fiat, vigilantism, a catastrophe of pandemics, and the hubris of hate. Young people today do not always know they have access to resources sufficient to help them awaken to their own magnificent power. They have had little lived experience or aspirational capital enough to envision a meaningful future in the face of clear and present dangers. In pluralistic America, young people under the age of 30 are customarily unchurched, Ryan, and claim no religious affiliation. We all know the work of Pew, who has identified this generation as, quote, spiritual but not religious. Countless youth and young adults and many of their elders agree that the church and faith institutions in general are foreign concepts, non-entities, non-existent to a population now come of age, irrelevant to challenge the conditions of the present age. Jay-Z popularized this view in his bold and withering rap declaration, "There is no church in the wild." These are not easy or welcome words for many who are in the church to hear. Recent literature reflects that young people find no home, no sense of belonging, no courageous or safe space in much of the internecine conflict, archaic systems, hierarchical values, and sheer hypocrisy that currently qualifies as church and serves as a subtext for injustice and a counter to human equality. Deeply ensnared in a world filled with trauma and fraught with physical and social death, young people find they have little margin for error in our day. As elders, we have been loath to live into our just convictions, to hold ourselves accountable, to have the strength to love personally and collectively, and have essentially let our descendants down. And so it is that yet and still again we turn to young people to remind us through the dynamism of their actions, through their mobilizations, how transformational change draws on resources from the present past or the recent past and establishes its own distinctive way forward. At the intersection of criminalized Black and brown bodies, economic disparities, political instabilities, viral pandemics, and the cyber strength of social media, a new moment has been recognized, the momentum seized, and a movement formed from below, in the streets, and in every setting where young people live, learn, work, and create. The injustices in our day and time seem overwhelming to many of us. And more than 3 years after Breonna Taylor was killed in the city where we live, Louisville, Kentucky, killed by law enforcement in a no-knock raid under false pretense in the darkness of night, there has been no real accountability for her death. Among the vanguard of the privileged, leadership has been absent. No officer has been principally charged, and our prolonged struggle for freedom continues. Anti-Blackness notwithstanding, there is profound hope in the relentless nature of today's freedom struggles. I consider these to be the dress rehearsals for that new humanity taking shape, with new modes of community coming into being, new collective lifeways emerging among today's disinherited that embrace all people from every background, condition, and circumstance. If we are only courageous enough to hear freedom's call. The movement for Black Lives Matter, with its fierce insistence that the liberation of Black folks is not only now, but it is also altogether bound up with humanity's liberation. This has helped to change our national discourse. Even as the cause against racist violence itself continues to transform, deepen, and become more complex, and as Black Lives Matter transitions into post-movement forms of advocacy, it has pierced the heart of injustice. BLM is part of an intersectional and interconnectional groundswell of siblings, partners, allies, participants, and movements, building networks, developing solidarity, committed to the internecine struggle for freedom. The intersectional witness is vast, and it is sometimes overlooked, and I'm just going to name a few. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, those determined dreamers who have transformed from an initial program and policy of the federal government into something that is now a movement of the undocumented. The Tarana Burke inspired and birthed Me Too movement, comprised mostly of women and some men in the U.S. and abroad, working in solidarity toward a world free of sexual violence, breaking the silence against rape, sexual harassment, and assault, and resolving to end the power of misogyny everywhere. The 2018 and 2022 and now 2023 marches and protests that we are seeing everywhere of students representing, galvanizing for action in support of stricter laws to end gun violence, from Parkland, Columbine, and Sandy Hook to Orlando, Las Vegas, Buffalo, and Uvalde, and across this country. There is the embodied movement for all women and pregnant people that finds complicated expression and momentum with the Dobbs decision and destruction of Roe versus Wade. The landmark Supreme Court decision of 50 years ago established a constitutional right to abortion as a major reproductive rights victory. Now, the struggle for a profound structural witness is being taken up anew at the grassroots and with the electorate to reject reproductive injustice and to work toward a world where such injustice is unthinkable. Even as we speak, members of the LGBTQIA+ community, their siblings and allies, people committed to justice in communities everywhere, are challenging anti-transgender legislation that seeks to deny trans and gender nonconforming people of their basic human rights, the freedom and agency to live into gender identities that do not adhere to socially constructed gender binaries. In this season of legislated injustice, social bigotry, and forms of violence, violation, and death against trans and gender non-conforming people, the collective work for freedom grows. There is the global movement of student climate strikes for change, embodied in Autumn Peltier, embodied in Greta Thunberg, and so many others who are challenging the world to take a stand on the climate crisis. There's Hands Up United, We Charge Genocide, Standing Rock, Dream Defenders, Move On, Color of Change, and so many more of recent years. They are black and brown faces and none too few white, disaffected youth in localities and municipalities everywhere. The forces of nature are great. The power of movement as great. It does not come always as fast as we want it. Sometimes change does not even seem to appear in our lifetime. An optimism of the will is required. And unless the work is done, no one will ever live to witness it. Today's freedom movements work with a resplendent faith in the power of right. It works outside the walls of the hierarchical church, outside the walls of Wall Street and corporate America. It works in the streets and on social media. Mostly young, they recognize that intersectional oppression is alive and well and will not be eliminated without sustained mass challenges. These are they, influencers in their own right, beyond the constraints of the church, who possess a surpassing rainbow faith in what is possible. I conclude with these words. What is freedom's call to communities of faith and to educational institutions? In the venerable words of Coretta Scott King, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never won. You earn it and win it in every generation. That is not what we have taught young people, or older ones for that matter. As a people in movement toward justice, reparation, and reconciliation, we are called to invite and inspire new generations of young people, and indeed all of us, to discover our own vital connections of spirit and to move beyond convention and orthopraxis to radical practices of love and belonging. For the faith community of every description, this can only mean acting on an ethic of love and the belief in the infinite worth of every human being everywhere. There is a fabulous dignity in difference. For Black churches, this means a return to the deep roots of our faith, to participation in the Black ecclesial and cultural vision of right relations, to the creation of a new word when and where necessary, the affirmation of every Black life, centering the people and by extension human community every step of the way. Only then can we bear witness to the possibilities of this future age. For educators, in the spirit of allyship and solidarity, we can join our research and scholarship with others who bear witness to pro humanitate in their own context, in their own language, in their own culture, on their own terms. As scholars, we can partner in our resolve to heed freedom's call, to invite subjugated knowledge to be our griot, teach to transgress, decolonize long-held traditions, overcome our own worst fears, and advance the common cause. We can advocate for poor and oppressed peoples, agitate for justice, foment peace, and build a common humanity under a friendly sky. As co-creators of the new day, we can engage in the kind of transcendent hope and prophetic advocacy that saves people's lives and makes our world whole. Expanding such a beloved community of the faithful, elders and young people, gender nonconforming and cisgender, persons of every description from every walk of life will dismantle intergenerational divides and bear witness together. In our struggle to create a new heaven and a new earth, a new world, we will search for common ground and find the sound of the genuine. On this life way, we will struggle with the full humanity of ourselves. We will embrace the rainbow of gender affection and expression. We will dismantle hierarchy and find that because of matters of the human heart, we will advocate for queer and transgender lives with an unconditional love. We will build glad networks and alliances across our various vocations, purviews, and worlds, and mobilize against all forms of bigotry and discrimination. We will advocate for a more just and verdant world, a clean and safe energy economy, one shared earth. We will embrace the universe displayed. We will model sanctuary for and with one another and our progeny, with the magnificent belief that the just society is possible and the knowledge that the safest place for any human being is within our hearts. God is with us.